because it really is happening. This isn't one of those things, where we say, well, maybe in 10 years or so, there'll be some effect. It's really happening now. I mean, nearly 30 million people have paid 150 euros to have their DNA tested.
Welcome to the Painting Onions podcast. I'm your host, Lorenz. I'm a clinical psychologist, and I interview leading scientists from different fields to provide multi-level, onion-like perspectives on how humans work. And today's guest is Robert Plomin. He is a behavioral geneticist, and we'll be talking about how DNA makes us who we are as individuals. That is, how DNA influences our psychological traits. For example, personality, cognitive abilities, or even mental health propensities. And we'll also be talking about the famous nature versus nurture debate and implications for parenting, for example, and in the end about the DNA revolution that comes about through polygenic scores. And these scores can be used pretty much from birth on, because our DNA never changes, to predict and thereby prevent all kinds of things. For example, and most importantly, medical issues and mental health issues. So I really think this is revolutionary, and I hope you have fun. So let's go. Okay, so Robert Plomin, welcome to the Painting Onions podcast. Thank you so much for taking your time.
Very nice to meet you, Lorenz.
So my first question is, you are a behavioral geneticist. Could you maybe explain what this means?
Yeah, well, people are familiar with terms like medical genetics and anthropological genetics, and genetics is dominant in almost all fields in the life sciences of biology, as well as psychology and increasingly sociology and economics. So behavioral genetics is like medical genetics. It's the genetics not of medical disorders, but of behavioral traits, both dimensions and disorders. So it's really to study individual difference, the genetic influence, that is, inherited DNA differences as they affect individual differences in psychological traits.
Okay, so but in the end, it's about psychological traits. So it's not, because I was confused about the behavioral part. So it's not just behavior in that sense, but also like the mind. And
yeah, I think there is that semantic difference, but from my point of view, psychology is the study of behavior. Okay. And that includes, mental behavior. It isn't just like behaviorism in the sense that you're only dealing with overt behavior. I think of it all as behavior, and that's like whole organism functioning. It certainly includes cognitive traits and mental illness, as well as more motoric. So it's a good point. We're just, my definition of behavior is very broad, and really I think psychology is the study of behavior.
Yes, I know what you mean.
But I know what you're talking about. Neuroscientists would think that they're studying maybe neural activity, but I think of that as neural behavior in a way. Right. But it's a semantic issue, and it's genetics of psychology is just as appropriate.
Yeah, okay, I see. Okay, so as I just mentioned in the part that the people don't see, that I studied psychology, and in my bachelor, basically the only point where we talked about DNA and genetics, at least as I remember it, was with like individual differences, and then it was always like, okay, almost each psychological trait is like 50% on average due to genetics and 50% due to the environment. Would you say that's correct, or is there a more refined view to just summing it up like that?
So where did you hear that?
It was just in my bachelor, I'm not sure.
An undergraduate course.
Right, like differential psychology, if I translate it like that. Yeah. Well,
yeah, I would agree mostly with that. There are nuances there, and there's a lot to misunderstand when people say it's 50% genetic. But it's an amazing change, because when I was an undergraduate in psychology, I never heard the word genetics ever. I mean, psychologists at that time in the 60s and 70s, they just never even considered the possibility of genetic influence. If anything, that was biology that had nothing to do with psychology. So it's a remarkable shift that I think most people have in these 50 years have come to accept the importance of inherited DNA differences. But there's so many things to say about that that involve misunderstandings. You know, we're talking about 1% of the 3 billion base pairs of DNA that differs between us. These are the inherited DNA differences. And people understand that, you know, like when you say hair color is heritable, people understand that you're talking about genetic differences that make people different in their hair color. But when you get to behavior, there's a lot of misunderstandings about it. And the most important one probably is to emphasize we're talking about why people differ. So 1% of our DNA bases, these steps in the spiral staircase of DNA, the double helix of DNA, 1% of those steps differ between us. And we're asking how much do those inherited DNA differences make a difference in our behavior, in our psychology? Now, 99% of those bases do not differ. We have exactly the same DNA sequence for 99% of those 3 billion base pairs. That's what makes us human. And, you know, that's equally important. But as psychologists, we're often concerned, I mean, maybe not so much neuroscientists, but a lot of psychologists are concerned about individual differences. Mental health and illness is an issue of differences. Why are some people schizophrenic and others not? Why do some kids have reading disability and others not? It's a specific question about differences, but it's a reasonable question to ask the extent to which these inherited DNA differences account for the differences we observe in behavior. And the answer over these 50 years is a lot. I mean, much more than anyone ever thought.
And it's, and I mean, let me show you your book. So I read this book, and
Nice book.
right. And you sum up some common misunderstandings, and I think especially this point about heritability. I think many people still, and I'm going to ask you about what heritability means, but like one misunderstanding is saying that, let's say, intelligence is 50% genetic, 50% environmental, and it does not mean that my intelligence is like 50% due to my DNA and 50% due to my environment, but more like, as you said, like heritability is about the differences between people and how much DNA can explain those differences. It's not
exactly right. I mean, that's probably the fundamental misunderstanding. We're describing differences, individual differences that exist in a particular population at a particular time with a particular mix of genetic and environmental differences. And you change any of that and you get a different answer. You could get a different answer. So we're not, you know, so it's quite possible that there's some other culture somewhere where individual differences in reading disability are not at all heritable, for example, or in a society where it's an illiterate society where they don't teach kids to read, the heritability is 0 because there's no variability. No one can read. You know, so we're describing differences that exist. And another qualification is we're describing differences that exist in the populations we study. And that doesn't include the extremes of the environment, say like abuse and neglect or trauma of war, as we're seeing now. We're talking about the normal range of variation. And so the thing is, we're describing what is rather than predicting what could be, because you can change the genetic influences and the environmental influences, and you'll change the relative influence of genetics and environment. It's a descriptive statistic like means and variances. So, you know, you can change the mean of a population in weight, as they did in New York, by outlawing those huge sugary drinks that people would get in America. And, you know, those sorts of public health changes really do make a mean difference. And that's a mean, though. And even with those mean differences, there'll still be a wide range of individual differences in body weight. And those individual differences in body weight, people are often surprised to find, are very substantially due to inherited DNA differences. About 60% of the differences between people in body weight in the cultures we've studied, mostly American, Northern European populations, 60% of the differences are due to inherited DNA differences. And that's not 100%, but that is a lot. It's a lot more than everything else we know put together. But it's to describe what is. So just to make that point, because it's kind of the critical one, that doesn't mean you can't change it. It just means on average, in the population, 60% of the differences are due to inherited DNA differences. But if I don't eat, I lose weight. So that's what could be. Yeah, if I wasn't such a pig and eat everything that's around, I wouldn't have trouble with my weight. I could change my behavior and change my weight. But the thing is, in the normal course of events, it doesn't make much of a difference. A lot of people are dieting all the time. It's not making much of a difference. As we know from psychological studies, dieting isn't very effective in the long run. You can do a crash diet and lose a lot of weight, and then you just kind of go back slowly, pound after pound, to your trajectory, which I think is largely a genetic trajectory. So it's the difference between what is and what could be, and the difference between individual differences and mean differences. So it's kind of hard to get your head around it, but people do understand it at some level. When you talk about genetic influence on eye color or hair color or height, most people accept that individual differences in height are due largely or substantially to inherited DNA differences. So anyway, there's a lot of these background things to say, but it gets a little boring if we go into it too much, I suppose.
Yeah, I think so too. But and I also mean, like, throughout the conversation, it will be popping up again, and maybe all in all, it's a nice way to understand the concept of heritability too. But could you maybe go into the twin and adoption studies, the method? Because people may ask, well, how do you know how much heritable a trait is actually?
Yeah, exactly right. And we're really lucky to have this natural experiment of twins. Most people are familiar with the fact that there are two types of twins, identical and fraternal twins. So 1% of all births are twins. People are often surprised by that. That means 1 out of 100 births are twins. So everybody knows some twins. And it really works. In a class of 500 students, you ask who are twins, and you get about 5 on average, So 1% of all births are twins, but people don't often know that 1/3 of those are identical twins. So identical twins is one fertilized egg, a zygote, that splits in the first few days of life. So each of those new zygotes has the same DNA. They're genetically identical to one another. And then they grow up in the same womb, and they're the same age when they're born. The other type of twin is very different. It's 2 separately fertilized eggs. So they're like any brother or sister who happens to be born at the same time. So if 2 eggs get released instead of just 1, they both get fertilized. And they're like any siblings. They're 50% similar genetically. So the neat thing about this then is it's a very nice experimental comparison, because you've got twins who are born together in the same womb and they grow up in the same family at the same age, but there's one massive difference. This one type of twin, identical twins, is twice as similar genetically as the other type of twin. So you have to predict if some trait is influenced by inherited DNA differences. You have to predict that identical twins will be more similar than non-identical twins, fraternal twins. Now, that doesn't mean identical twins have to be 100% similar and fraternal twins 50% similar, because that would be the case if a trait was 100% heritable. And that is the case for things like fingerprints. And there are some things that are, certainly eye color, hair color, are 100% similar in identical twins and 50% similar in not fraternal twins, because those traits are 100% heritable. In fact, those traits are often used to diagnose whether twins are identical or not. But with one item, one question, if you meet a pair of twins, first of all, you know identical twins. I mean, they're just so similar, but, and certainly if they're opposite sex, you know they're not identical twins. And so half of fraternal twins are same sex, half are different sex. So a better experiment is to compare the same sex fraternal twins to the identical twins, because identical twins are, of course, always the same sex. So with one question, you can, if you find a pair of twins and they look pretty similar, you don't know if they're similar, one question will give you about 95% accuracy in determining whether they're identical or fraternal. And that is, when they were growing up, did people have trouble telling them apart? And that's because that question subsumes a lot of physical traits that are highly heritable: height, weight, eye color, hair texture, body shape, you know? So if you know identical twins, though, especially when they're kids, they're just amazingly similar. And the mistakes that are often made is looking at little differences and calling them fraternal twins, for example. And an interesting study is that obstetricians at birth, you ask, you know, like this frequently happens still. You're teaching undergraduates and say you're twins, are you identical or fraternal? And there are either two twins there, or they show me a photo or something and say, oh no, you know, we're identical. And they have different hair color, they're hugely different size, you know, they just look totally different, like any brother and sister. You say, well, how do you know you're identical? And it's almost, the answer almost always is, because at birth, the obstetrician told my mother, oh, they're identical. And that's done on the basis of whether there's one placenta. It's done on the basis of after birth information. And that's totally useless. It's no better than flipping a coin. But it's kind of cool in a way, because the obstetrician has so much power at that moment of birth, you know, that the mother's just given birth, not to one kid, but to two kids. And then this godlike figure says they're identical. End of story. I mean, for the rest of their lives, they're identical, you know? So that creates a nice experiment, though, because it means there's quite a few misdiagnosed twins where the parents think they're not identical, but they are identical. And so comparisons have been done there, and it shows it doesn't make much difference whether the parents are mistaken about the zygosity of their twins or not, you know? So that's an example of how I can go off on these tangents all night long. So you've got to hold me back here.
Yeah. So the question is about how you can like predict the heritability from those twin studies or adoption studies, because maybe you can explain a little bit how like you can study twins apart, raised apart in two different families, for example, with 100% or 50%, and also adoptees, and like what the major findings were of those studies you did like a couple of decades.
Well, where we got to was just the classic twin method, where you compare identical and fraternal twins. And so I said that if a trait's influenced by genetics, you'd have to predict identical twins are more similar than fraternal twins. So what the method involves in estimating heritability, that is the effect size of genetic influence, is by the difference in correlations between identical and non-identical twins. So if a trait is 100% heritable, identical twins should be 100% similar, and fraternal twins should be 50% similar. But in psychology, we don't have traits that are 100% heritable. You said before, 50% of traits on average are heritable. The heritability of traits in psychology is about 50% on average. That goes from about 40% for personality to maybe 60, 70% for cognitive traits. But it's a whole lot of variance. And where that estimate comes from is by the extent of the difference between the correlations for identical and fraternal twins. So for example, for weight, identical twins are about, say, 0.75. Their correlation is 0.75 for weight. I assume your listeners know what a correlation is from 0 to 1.
Yes, I think they know.
Perfect resemblance. And fraternal twins are correlated about 0.45. Then it suggests it's not 100% heritable, but that difference, you can double that difference, because fraternal twins aren't 0% similar, they're 50% similar. So if you double the difference between the 0.75 and the 0.45, you get 0.3, and then you double that and get a 0.6. And so that's simply how the estimate comes about. It's more sophisticated, but that's the essence of it, that the bigger the difference between those correlations, the more heritable a trait is. Now, the simplest design is an adoption design with identical twins reared apart. And that's what you had mentioned. That's an adoption design, but you take these genetically identical people and you rear them in uncorrelated environments. That is, they don't have to be different environments, they just have to be uncorrelated environments, where they've kind of like been randomly assigned to different environments. Now, you can imagine that doesn't happen very often. There's only a couple hundred pairs of these identical twins reared apart, but they also provide consistent information that identical twins reared apart are just as similar in weight as identical twins who were reared together in the same family from birth. So that's powerful. But the other side of adoption designs, it's the converse. Instead of taking genetically identical individuals, identical twins, and finding twins who were reared apart, you can study genetically unrelated kids reared together. So in America, a third of adopted families adopt a second child. Those children come from different mothers and fathers through the adoption process. So they're genetically unrelated to each other, but if they're adopted early in life, they're like siblings in the sense that they share the same family environment. And this with weight, for example, you'd think they'd be similar. They have the same parents feeding them the same stuff, setting role models for lifestyles and exercise. But the correlation for adoptive siblings, as they're called, is 0 for weight. They don't correlate at all, even though they grow up in the same family with the same nutritional environment. And so the adoption design consists of those two prongs: genetically related people reared apart, and genetically unrelated people reared together. And what's really nice about the adoption and twin designs is you can see they're very different, and they have different assumptions, and yet they all converge on the same conclusion, that psychological traits that have been studied using these methods show very substantial genetic influence. On average, about 50% heritability across all psychological traits that have been studied. In fact, things have changed so much from when I was in graduate school in the 1970s, where I never heard about genetics. I was in the only program in the world that taught behavioral genetics, one course in behavioral genetics. And back then, it was, you had to be very careful about even suggesting there might be genetic influence. But now the challenge, honestly, is to find any trait in psychology, reliably measured, that does not show significant genetic influence. So that's an amazing shift, over 50 years' time. I don't think there's been any bigger change in psychology at that sort of basic sort of conceptual level. There's, of course, been major technological advances, but I think that's a really astounding sort of finding. And it thrills me to have been part of that, just watching this happen over these 50 years. And don't you agree that we've done some surveys, nothing very recently, but don't you think most psychologists would say, yeah, sure, there's some genetic influence?
Definitely. Like I said, in my bachelor, it wasn't like not a surprise to hear that. I mean, I probably wouldn't have guessed that it's like pretty much 50-50 on average, but I definitely had in my mind, I don't know where, maybe even from high school or something, that genetics is really important in like shaping us who we are. But still, I think, and like in reading your whole book, it's still maybe more than we think. And we will talk a little bit more in a later question about the nature of nurture, and then also, of course, about the DNA revolution with the polygenic scores and how this can actually help us. Because for one, like it was implied basically in this course that I told you about, that okay, it's 50-50 and it's important, but basically we can't do anything about it, so let's focus on the environmental part, focus on our psychological studies that we do normally. That was the bottom line, so to speak. And I'm sure you can, or do you want to comment on that right away?
Yeah, I mean, there's some long answers to that, but I mean, the short answer is, in terms of understanding, it's important to say that all psychological traits show this very substantial genetic influence, because that means that we have less control than we thought we had, and we have to learn to deal with this. And it doesn't mean you can't do anything about it. In fact, I think, contrary to what your teacher said, the best way to do something environmental is to find something genetic, because you know what you've got, and you can actually predict and maybe intervene to prevent problems before they occur. Because in psychology, I know you study CBT, but other than CBT, I'm not that impressed with how we can fix problems after they're full blown. Like obesity, you can do gastric bands and dramatic surgery, but it's very hard to treat people who are obese or alcoholic or schizophrenic. I think the hope for psychology is to be able to predict and prevent these problems from occurring. And interventions early are generally more effective than waiting until something happens and then trying to fix it. Like the example in the medical area is heart problems. Once someone has a severe heart attack, their life is kind of screwed. You can fix them up a bit, but the quality of life goes down, but you can prevent heart attacks. And then most wonderful thing about genetics is that DNA is the best early warning system we have, because your DNA does not change during your life. So if we find the genes for the heritability of heart disease, as we are, you can use them to predict risk for heart problems, and then you can prevent these problems, often using very low-tech techniques, like just paying attention to the messages we all hear. Eat well, exercise, monitor your heart, watch your blood pressure, those sorts of things. We all hear that, but we don't do much about it. But if you knew you had a 10-fold greater risk for having a severe heart attack by the time you're 40, you're likely to pay more attention to that. And so it's a very low-tech procedure. And then you can go up and do more technologically sophisticated things. And it's really worth it, because if you can prevent one heart attack from happening, it's massive. It's said in the UK it's something like €500,000 for a severe heart attack, let alone the suffering and loss of quality of life. So prevention really has to be the goal, and that's DNA's forte.
Yeah, I'm really excited about this prevention part, and I will ask you later when we come to the polygenic scores, a little bit more about these implications. And it's also great.
I guess the main thing I wanted to say, though I didn't really hit that very hard, is when your teacher said, well, yeah, there's genetics, but you can't do anything about that. Let's just look at the environment. I don't think so. I think what we want to do is use the environment in interplay with genetics, because the way genetics works is to have people use their environments. And, it isn't like the environment's imposed on people. And so I know we'll get into this later in the nature of nurture, but it's really important to get rid of this idea, well, genetics can't do anything about that, so let's just focus on what's left. It's a mistake in lots of different ways that we might go into.
Yeah.
Like the environment doesn't work the way we thought it worked. And when guys say things like that, they sort of mean, well, we can just manipulate the environment to change people. Well, psychologists have been trying to do that for a long time, and it doesn't work very well.
Yeah.
So
okay.
we'll probably talk some more about that later.
Yeah, and I think it's exciting, definitely. So another question, or like what people might find interesting, is that the heritability tends to increase over time, over the lifetime, and people might find this counterintuitive because more and more environment is piling up, so to speak. Could you explain why that's the case?
Yeah, very good point. It's in psychology, a good rule of thumb is to really pay attention to things that your grandmother didn't know. I mean, because often psychology is criticized for coming up with things that everybody sort of knew. Now, that's not to belittle that, though, because a lot of things we thought we knew aren't true.
Mm-hmm.
But it's particularly interesting when you find something that goes against what you thought would be the case. And you're absolutely right. If you poll people, as we did, and ask them, do you think heritability increases or decreases during the lifespan? First of all, you got to explain what you mean by heritability. What does it mean by changing? But once people understand it, they'd say, well, yeah, of course, the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, as Shakespeare said, or accidents and illnesses pile up. Environmental influences become increasingly important throughout life. Whereas people also make the mistake of thinking genetics is only what happens at the moment of conception.
Mm-hmm.
But, moment's reflection suggests, well, that's not true. I mean, baldness and so many things you can see happen developmentally, so genes affect development differently, throughout the lifespan. So genetics can change, environmental can change, DNA doesn't change, but genetic effects can change as you go through life. Like schizophrenia probably doesn't show up until late adolescence because the brain hasn't matured to the point of being able to have good delusions and hallucinations until you get to that age. So genetic effects definitely change. So so when you get people to understand all this, they would say, well, sure, heritability goes down. That is, environmental influences go up during the life course. And it's really interesting that when heritability changes, as it does for general cognitive ability and perhaps for body weight and maybe for depression, when heritability changes, it goes up rather than down. And you wonder, well, how can that be? And we don't really know what the answer is, but I think the answer is the nature of nurture in a way, what we call genetic gene-environment correlation. That is, the environment isn't what happens to you. The environment that affects you is an environment that you create by selecting environments and modifying environments and perceiving environments differently in a way that fosters your genetic propensities. So I know that sounds kind of highfalutin, but it's like if you've ever seen young kids who are musically gifted, for example, or athletically gifted, it's almost hard to hold them down. It isn't like to develop their skills, they need the best teachers in the world or whatever. Musically gifted kids, with Spotify and everything, they don't need anything anymore, but, they would make their own music. They would hang out with kids who like music. They just get more and more into it and better at it. And I think that sort of gene environment correlation is the way genetics works. And so that would suggest as you go through life, and especially as you leave home and make your own way in the world, you create environments that suit you. You hang out with the people that feel right and you do the things that feel right. So that's an example of gene environment correlation that would lead to greater heritability because it increases the genetic differences between people.
Yeah, interesting. And I have to give credit here to one professor in my master's. He actually said this too. He had this explanation that basically you for one, you get more and more autonomous. You can really select like what you like, and also maybe you more and more know what you like, because sometimes maybe you don't know what you like. And when we talk about parenting later, you will probably also like give the advice for parents to help the children find out what they like, for example.
I hope we do come back to that because I think that's
Yeah.
such an important point about parenting.
Right. Okay, so another question that I have is, so I think everyone who listens to this will know that, and I think you said it already, your own DNA is like 50% from your mom, 50% from your dad. So I was wondering this basic question, like how can it be if everyone has 50% from his or her mom, 50% from his or her dad, how many people are so different from their parents and many people are so similar to their parents externally and also internally? How can it work?
Yeah, Well, if it were a single gene, it wouldn't. It would be a 50-50 thing like that. Half of the, for a single gene trait, you get one, we call it allele. So there's a gene, it means a lot of different things. And so we talk about one step in the spiral staircase as a locus, a place in Latin. And it can have 99% of those steps are all the same. So they don't have any differences. But when there's a difference, we call them alleles. There's a different form of the gene at these steps. So if it's one step difference, a single gene difference, then 50% of the offspring will have one parent's allele and 50% will have the other. Now, you don't know which allele it is because the parent has two alleles, right? So they're still 50% similar to their parents, but it's more like the way people think about it from Mendel, the way we learned about genetics from Mendel. But what we're talking about with psychology and medical disorders as well is traits influenced by many, many genes. And so that means, on average, kids are 50% similar. If we measure their genetic differences, they will be 50% similar to each parent. But each child will only be 50% similar to siblings, right? Because of that. So genetics predicts differences within families because you're 50% similar, but you're 50% different from your first degree relatives. And I think DNA, when we get onto that, one of the things it's going to show people is just how different genetically siblings are in a family, because they are 50% different. And so the range of genetic differences within a family is really huge. And that has a lot of implications that we might go into later. But it's important for parents to know that their children, to the extent that traits are genetically influenced, it means that their children are going to be different from each other. And that's kind of hard to take for some parents, like university educated parents who have a child who just isn't very interested in academia and they want to do other things. And it's really hard to accept that. So and why are some children different? What siblings different from each other? I mentioned in my book the story of my sister and me, and we were always very different academically. I read early. I loved school. And again, it's gene environment correlation because I was good at school, and got a lot of praise for it. My sister, on the other hand, was slow to read, just didn't like school. And schools will assume, well, that's the fault of the parents or the kid's lazy or whatever. But really, when you start thinking about genetics, you say, well, we've got to really recognize that kids are different genetically and respect those differences. I mean, my sister went on to do training in blood analysis in a lab, and she really likes that fine sort of work. And, it's tremendously important work. People can live or die on the basis of those analyses, So I think we need to recognize that even within a family, children are very different genetically.
Yeah, and I think in this topic of parenting, I think there it really actually isn't as much in their heads that genetics is important, like in the general public. Definitely. I talked to some parent, like I said, I'm in training for becoming a CBT therapist, and for example, I had there some parents who had like high degrees and high expectations, and I tested the child, and his IQ wasn't that great, so and they also really like put pressure on him in a way, and it's sad to see. And they also said, like, what did we do wrong? Didn't like teach him enough about language or something like that? So they were also like blaming themselves for his failure, so to speak. And it's sad to see that so many parents think like that.
Yes, I really agree. And that's why, there are literally thousands of books on parenting, and they're often very dogmatic. They're by Dr. So-and-so. And they're, as recent research has shown, they're not evidence-based at all. by and large. But worst of all, they hardly ever even mention genetics. Whereas I think the single most important thing that parents need to know about raising children is genetics. That kids do differ genetically doesn't mean you can't do anything, but it means if you really think your kid's a blob of clay you can mold to be anything you want it to be, you really got to read my book or read about genetics, because that's devastating for parenting. And especially when you think of, for example, I mean, 1% of the population becomes schizophrenic. And I get a letter a month from parents where they're saying, we did everything for our kid, everything was going well. And then in adolescence, they became withdrawn. And then by the time they were 18 or 19, they were not in touch with reality anymore. They were really schizophrenic. And again, it's the business about what did we do wrong? And that reminds me is environmentalism was so bad in psychology when I was in graduate school that the textbooks actually said that schizophrenia was caused by what your mother did to you in the first few years of life. So imagine now your kid becomes schizophrenic. You thought everything was great. You were having a good family relationship. And then they become schizophrenic in late adolescence. And then you're told it's because of what you did in the first few years of life. And that is incredibly wicked. And it's also just totally wrong. There's no evidence that these Freudian things about breastfeeding and toilet training make a bit of difference.
Yeah.
So it's a really important message for parents to hear. And all I want is for them to just say, what about genetics? So next time they read something in the paper, which I read every few days about, you know, where the money is in parenting media is in scaring parents, because they're already anxious about having kids. You know, they think one false move and the kid's going to be ruined for life, you know? And so I think they really need to say, what about genetics? Genetics is the single most important factor. And as a parent, as you were saying, the best thing they can do is, instead of imposing on their child what they want them to be, so it's so much better to give them opportunities to find out what they like to do and to help them do it. And to do it not because you're trying to make them into something you want them to be, but because you love them and you want them to be happy. And it's a really important distinction. And part of being a parent, I think, is to kind of watch your child become who they are developmentally, genetically, rather than imposing your will on them, because it doesn't work very well in the end. I mean, you can do it. If you want your kid to be an Olympic sprinter, well, you know, good luck to you. And you can probably make them sprint a lot faster than they would have without training. But kids aren't stupid. They look around at their friends who are kind of more natural runners, and you know, they say, this kid without any training can just, you know, beat me by a second in the 100-meter, you know. So it just makes so much more sense going with the flow of genetics rather than kind of swimming upstream and fighting it. It's an important thing. It's, you know, we're saying again, it's not that you can't do something. You know, you can make a difference, but to too much of an extent that we imply to parents that's what they ought to be doing. They ought to be making their kids be this way or that way, instead of trying to recognize the differences and helping kids be who they want to be. Because I really believe appetites are just as important as aptitudes, you know, in kids' development. But the main message is we just want them to be happy, and we want parents to be happy, and they'll be much happier if they, you know, are more laid back about it. I especially see it with my friends who, you know, they spend their whole life not getting pregnant, and then in their late 30s, suddenly, you know, they want to have children, and then they can't have children, you know, for one reason or another, and they panic. And then when they do have a child, it's this precious child, and they're so afraid all the time. And I find that they're not enjoying it. And it seems like such a waste to me, you know? So sorry to go on about it, but
no, it's interesting.
It's the single most important thing, I think, for parents to know, that genetics is very important and that they don't have as much control as they think. It's not to say you can't do anything, but just don't think about making your kid be the way you want them to be, but instead finding out what they want to do.
Yeah, and I think it's really soothing message, because like you alluded to, I think nowadays there's so many of those parents who are like this helicopter parents and always cautious and anxious about doing the right step all the time. So I think it's a really soothing message. But of course, maybe some will say or be afraid that, well, I can't do much now, and I want to do much. So in a way, that's a disappointing message, maybe. But well, in the end, it's about the science, and it's an important message. So I was also wondering, I mean, the nature versus nurture. So for one, in German we say Anlage oder Umwelt, which means disposition or environment.
Yeah.
So and I mean it's a short explanation. So nurtures. Let me just say it. So nurtures, like historically, I think, and I mean maybe Freudian influence was there also, saying like the nurture is really important, and the education of the children and the very early ages. But right now, probably you would also say it's rather nature versus environment, right? So this is my first question.
Well, you're right that when you say nature or nurture, it implies that there's genetics, and then the rest of the influence is environmental, but of a specific type. By nurture, people do mean kind of systematic effects of family environment.
Right. Yeah.
And the other major finding from genetics is that the environment's important, but it doesn't work like that. Whatever the environment is, it's not nurture in the sense of systematic effects of family environment. I mean, for example, with the weight, you know, genetically unrelated kids reared in the same family are not similar in weight, even though they share the same nutritional environment. So Judith Harris in 1998 wrote a famous book called The Nurture Assumption, where she popularizes this research from behavioral genetics, saying that the environment's important, but whatever it is, it's operating to make two kids in the same family different from one another. And we call that non-shared environment. So there's long stories to that, but it's to say that when you say nature or nurture, the nurture side of that is complicated. It's not the simple systematic effects of family environment. And I've come to feel, after 30 years of research trying to find these non-shared environmental influences, that it's basically non-systematic, idiosyncratic, stochastic, in a word, chance factors. And psychologists don't like to hear that. But, you know, when you talk to, like, I don't know how you got to where you are, but when I talk to people about why are you doing what you're doing, people often tell a story that it all made sense, but really at a level of deeper honesty, people will admit chance plays a major role in how they've developed. I mean, certainly I talk about it in my book about examples of how my life was determined by those, you know, that movie Sliding Doors, and where one particular moment can be a tipping point. And if it went one way, like the train doors had closed before you got on, your life would have gone that way. Yeah. And then, you know, so these sliding door moments or tipping points, I think, are much more important than we recognize. And in a lot of areas of science, including, you know, economics and basic physics, we're talking chance plays a much bigger role than we think.
Yeah, I also have a question to that later, but maybe to the nature versus nurture. Sometimes I hear people saying something like, well, nature versus nurture, that doesn't exist because DNA is always depends upon the environment, so it's always both. And then they say something like, so actually, since genes only get expressed through environment, that means that the environment is the important part, because if you have a bad environment, bad genes get expressed. If you have a good environment, good genes get expressed. So just design the environment and everything's fine.
Yeah. Yep.
So what would you
No,
say?
I know exactly right. And it's interesting to me that you haven't been using your hands very much, but when you started talking about nature and nurture and how they work together, you use your hands. And that's interesting because I know of half a dozen developmental psychology films where someone's saying exactly that. Say, well, there's nature and there's nurture, but you know, they both work together. So what's the deal here? You know, you
Yeah.
keep, and again, that's why we talked about definitions of heritability. That's true at the level of an individual. You can't put DNA on this table and have it do anything. It has to be in an internal organismic environment as well as an external environment expected by the species evolutionarily. So to do anything, genes need an environment. And DNA by itself doesn't do anything. It needs RNA, which expresses the DNA. But at the level of individual differences, see, that's at the level of nomothetic, you know, at the average behavior of people. It's the 99% of DNA. It's that same sort of issue that makes us similar. But at the level of individual differences, it certainly makes sense to say, do these inherited DNA differences make a difference in behavior? And that's without knowing anything about what happens in between. That is, genes' DNA has to be expressed before it can make a difference. And you could study it in the brain. Where does it make an effect in the brain? But if we just take these DNA differences and relate them to differences in behavior, then that's what we mean by heritability. And you don't have to know about all the steps in between. So this thing about expression or epigenetics, which is slow motion gene expression, it's probably the first question I often get in a public audience because everybody hears about epigenetics. And so the thing is, this DNA difference, if it's not expressed, that is, you know, say it's the same DNA in all the cells in our body, but the DNA expressed in the brain, say 70% of all genes are expressed in the brain. Different genes are expressed in the liver, for example, obviously, or in the blood or skin. So a DNA difference that is not expressed can't make a difference. So yes, it has to be expressed, but that doesn't somehow negate the importance of inherited DNA differences. So it really is more a matter of emphasizing again that we're talking about individual differences and what makes people different. And inherited DNA differences, it's amazing just how this 1% of all the DNA, it's amazing what a big effect those differences have on behavior. And another part of it is that it's going to be very hard to go from genes to brain to behavior pathways, which is what biologists and neuroscientists want to do, because what we've learned from the DNA revolution is we're talking about thousands of tiny DNA differences, and that's going to work its way through the brain. We have enough trouble in neuroscience finding simple pathways, but imagine if, say, schizophrenia or reading disability is influenced by really tens of thousands of inherited DNA differences. They all have effects in the brain, sure, but you know, good luck trying to find them. Now, people will try to find them, and that's great. But the point I want to make is we don't need to know anything about the biological pathways between DNA and behavior if what we're trying to do is to predict individual differences in behavior.
Yeah. Okay. Could you maybe talk a little bit more about the nature of nurture now? I mean, you again alluded to it already, but I think it's really counterintuitive again, because as you also said, that we read so many like correlations of like reading, you say it in the book, reading to your children correlates with reading ability later in life, or hanging out with aggressive peers correlates with being aggressive, and so on. Could you maybe explain what the nature of nurture is and how this gives another perspective on those correlations?
Yeah, well, that's the third big finding I talk about in my book, I mean, the first one is that genetics is the major systematic source of making us who we are as individuals. And the second is this one I alluded to about non-shared environment, that the environment doesn't work the way we thought it worked. It's not these systematic effects of nurturing, of mothering and parenting. But the third finding is also about the environment, and that is that what looks like environmental effects are often genetic effects in disguise. And this first came about in the 1980s when I was studying environmental measures in an adoption study that I was doing. And one of the measures we used was this widely used measure called the Home Observation for Measurement of the Environment, HOME. And it's one of the best predictors of children's cognitive development. And so I just compared adoptive and non-adoptive siblings on this measure. So we go into their homes, we observe and interview them and score them for the home observation measure for each sibling. These are adoptive siblings and non-adoptive siblings. And the adoptive siblings were much more similar than the non-adoptive siblings. The genetically related siblings were much more similar on the home, that is how their parents were interacting with them, than the adoptive parents, suggesting, at first I thought, well, this is just a mistake, but it implies that there could be genetic influence on what we're measuring as the home. And this is now, there's every measure that gets used in psychology shows environmental measure shows genetic influence. You know, like you were saying, parents reading to kids. And it's because in psychology, we think of the environment as something out there that happens to us, from the old stimulus response learning theory sorts of approaches. And instead, as I was saying before, genetics suggests that the way genes work is to push us in certain directions, to nudge us in certain directions, to create environments correlated with our genetic propensities. And that we talk about three types of gene-environment correlation: a passive type, because parents and children are 50% similar genetically and they share environments. That's one way in which gene-environment could work. It's passive in the sense that nobody's doing anything in particular. It just happens because they're genetically related. The second is more interesting. It's reactive, where parents respond to differences in their kids. And the third is active, where kids just create their own environments. And so an example is I use this with my grandchildren. I have one grandchild who would just let me read to her all day long. I mean, which is what I thought grandchildren were supposed to do. You know, I say, okay, Grandpa will read to you now. And, you know, they say, oh, wonderful. So that's great. But other grandchildren who that would almost be torture. You know, they want to roughhouse and kick a ball around. And so it turns out more and more, I think we're responding to differences in our kids rather than making those differences in our kids. And I think it's such an important point. It goes with what we were saying before about, you know, recognizing that kids are different. And if I said to those other grandchildren, you're a grandchild, I'm a grandparent, I read to you, you sit there and appreciate it, you know, it doesn't work. So I think this idea of gene-environment correlation is important, and that's why our environmental measures in psychology show genetic influence. And this is a good example of why you got to ask yourself all the time, what about genetics? So you take the most widely used measures in psychology are life events, for example. And you say, well, life events, that's something that happens to you. But look what's on those measures. The biggest ones are things like divorce, moving house, financial disruption, getting in conflicts with people. That isn't the environment out there happening to us. This is our experience. We contribute to this, and genetics contributes to that. So that's how genetics enters into our so-called environmental measures. But it's really, it's an interesting thing how labeling things kind of stops us from thinking about them. Now, these are environmental measures. So what are you talking about? Genetics? I mean, it doesn't make sense. Environments don't have genetics. In fact, a really interesting case is the the most widely used single item in environmental item to measure, to relate to kids' cognitive development or school development is number of books in the home. Now you say, okay, there's no DNA there. Books don't have DNA. But you say, well, what about genetics? Why is it some homes have a lot more books than others? They don't get there by themselves. The parents put them there. Parents who have a lot of books in their home probably read to their kid, and their kids probably do better at school. They learn to read easier, but it's not caused by the number of books in the home. It's caused by gene environment correlation. The parents and children are genetically related to one another. And this sounds silly, but when you read about these correlations between parenting or homes and home environments and kids, how well they do at school, for example, it's very difficult to resist interpreting that correlation causally. Now, we all know as psychologists, the correlations do not imply causation. But when you say, as in the example you gave, parents who read a lot to their kids have kids who do better at reading at school, it's very hard to resist interpreting that causally. I mean, it makes sense. It's not stupid to interpret it causally, but you got to say, what about genetics? And when you do, you find that measure, as well as most all environmental measures we widely use in psychology, are actually substantially influenced genetically. 25% rather than 50% for behavioral traits. But that 25% usually ends up accounting for about half of the correlations between environmental measures and children's outcome. So that's why I say that what looks like systematic effects of the environment, how much parents read to kids is correlated with how well they do at school, is actually genetic effects in disguise.
But nature of nurture or nature of environment does not mean that if for simplicity we have a trait with 50-50, it does not mean that it's taking another part of the environment, but it's just part of this 50% genetics, right?
Yeah, to the extent that there's genetic influence on, say, like number of books in the home, that has to do it's not the DNA of the books, so it has something to do with parents who put books on the shelves. We don't know what those factors are, but we do know that there are genetic causes of why homes differ in the number of books that they have. And the most plausible explanation is that some parents are more book-oriented than others.
Yeah. Okay, so now I would like to speak about the dark matter of this 50% environment. You already said a little bit about this. Maybe could you elaborate on this a little bit more? Because I think it's
dark matter. Dark
fascinating.
matter is a good phrase for it, I think. I think even though this message has been around for 30 years, that the way the environment works is very different from the way we thought it worked. And despite books like Judith Harris's book, and I wrote a book about it too, called Why Are Siblings So Different? I think psychologists still need to be reminded of it, because it's such an important finding that the environment's important, but it's not these systematic effects that psychologists from Freud onwards thought were so important. That is, parenting differences. It's something else. It's important. But if my understanding is right, that the reason it's so hard to find those influences is because they are basically idiosyncratic and stochastic. They're not these broad systematic effects of parenting or schools. It's more idiosyncratic experience. It's not to say they're not real, but they're often tiny things that build up and become bigger things. I mean, we don't know what they are, but there are some dramatic examples, like you can think of turning points in your life, or, stories that people tell, like Bill Clinton always tells a story that he got into politics because he shook John F. Kennedy's hand when he was 16 years old. And maybe, I mean, you can't really trust much of what Bill Clinton said probably, but, people do have stories like that they tell about their lives looking back on it. But I think to a larger extent, we need to recognize what a big role chance plays in our lives environmentally.
Yeah, and I think it's kind of sad or disappointing, because also, like, for me, as one person, I don't like the idea that chance is playing such a big role. Do you know of other hypotheses from other people in your field?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, for psychodynamically oriented people said they talked about scapegoating and sort of differences within a family where parents start to label one kid as the good kid and one kid as the bad kid, for example. And scapegoating means you blame the one kid for all the bad stuff. But that's like a systematic effect, but it's just operating within families. And it hasn't proven to be true. Judith Harris's thing was, in her book, 1998, The Nurture Assumption, she was saying, psychologists have only studied the family. And if you want to understand why kids in the same family are different, that's not a very good place to start, because they're in the same family. But when you do study that, you find that parents actually treat children in the same family differently, especially if you ask the kids, they would say, yes, my mother loves you best, or father's always giving you special treatment. If you ask parents, they don't admit to it very much. They say, oh no, we treat the children the same, but there's a strong norm for them to say that. If you videotape observations between interactions between parents and kids, you do see differences in parental treatment of kids. Not as much as the kids say, but a lot more than the parents say. So there are these differences within families in parental treatment, but they don't make a difference. The differences that occur, so there are these differences in parental treatment that we can measure even in videotaped observations. And they do, some of them, to a lesser extent, relate to differences in the kid's behavior. And see, most people would stop there and say, well, okay, there you go. There is non-shared environment, environmental differences within a family that are correlated with kids' developmental outcomes. But we've been here before, and you got to say, but what about genetics? Maybe it isn't those differences in parenting causing the differences in outcome. Maybe it's the parents responding to genetic differences between their kids. And that's what we found in a dozen studies of this type, that it's really genetically mediated, those effects. So in the end, we haven't really been able to find true non-shared environmental influences that are causing these differences in behavior. And I think another very good hypothesis is that it's idiosyncratic and chance only by the standards of how we currently measure the environment. So with genetics, what we've learned is initially people thought, yeah, genetic influence, find the gene, one gene. But what we know is there are thousands of genes that affect any trait, tens of thousands. So that means they have incredibly tiny effects. Well, what if that's true about the environment? It's not these big factors like parental discipline or the quality of school you went to. What if it's all these micro environmental millisecond by millisecond experiences? Well, we're not close to measuring all of that. But I do think it's possible with big data and the new smart technologies that maybe we can measure experience at a much more fine-grained level. But it won't be easy, because that means there'll be very small effects and there'll be lots of them. So you need big samples to be able to have the power to detect them. But I think the analogy with DNA is interesting. And a major difference is we know a lot about DNA. We know the mechanism of heredity. We know the triplet code of DNA. And we know it's in the double helix of DNA in the cells. Now think about the environment. What do we know about the mechanisms by which the environment works? We really don't know anything comparable to that. So environment's a lot harder. I often say genetics is easy, the environment's hard.
Yeah, I also thought about the analogy of polygenic scores and then hypothetical poly-environmental scores, because, and we will come to the DNA revolution in a second, with all those thousands of genes and then thousands of environmental experiences and so on. And there are also, like with the polygenic scores, where you have weighted genetic effects, and then in the environment you can have rated effects, for example, like you said, with those JFK moments, which might be then like a large effect, so to speak. Yeah, I think it's really interesting, but like I said, kind of nerve-wracking to not know what's going on there actually. But
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about the DNA revolution. So maybe could you explain polygenic scores, maybe also with a little historical background? You also mentioned already like the candidate gene approach a little bit, and how
Yeah.
this was disappointing, but then led to this new DNA revolution.
Yeah, great. Well, that's a great lead into this. With the findings I've discussed so far about the importance of genetics and non-shared environment and the nature of nurture, these are huge findings from my point of view, in terms of psychology, but also socially and in lots of ways. They impact education and parenting. So that was 30 years of my career, and I would have been quite satisfied, if that's all we got to. And back then, say in the 80s, no one ever thought we'd be measuring DNA. You could just about measure some single gene disorders, but even that was very difficult. But the DNA revolution came about when it became possible to actually identify differences in DNA itself, not in products of DNA like blood types. Everyone's familiar with blood types. Well, that isn't a DNA difference. It's a genetic difference, and it's one that's 100% heritable. So it's kind of useful as a marker, but it doesn't help you very much because there aren't that many of those. There's just a handful, a few dozen really. But what if you could actually measure differences in DNA itself? So that started happening in the 1980s. And I won't go into the whole history of that, but once we could begin to measure DNA differences directly, people said, wow, I mean, I was blown away by it, thinking we can actually identify some of the DNA differences. And from a scientific point of view, that had to be the way to go, because by then, at least behavioral geneticists were realizing everything's heritable. So it wasn't very interesting studying a new trait and saying, oh, look, it's heritable, because everything's heritable. The real way forward would be to find the environmental differences that make a difference. And we weren't having much luck with that. But if we could find the DNA differences themselves, there's so much you could do about it, ending with this notion we've addressed briefly of prediction, which is where I think we want to go with this. So when that first began to be possible in the 90s, there were hundreds of what we call candidate gene studies in psychology. So if you're interested in hyperactivity, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, you might want to study a neurotransmitter, dopamine transporter, that is related to methylphenidate's effect on hyperactivity. So you study things that are in the pathway and you say, well, this might be a candidate gene. So you look at DNA differences in that neurotransmitter. Now, the reason they did that is, we did that, is because it was very expensive and time consuming to measure one DNA difference. So you could study maybe a few DNA differences in the transporter gene, or if you're interested in depression, serotonin, these neurological models of what's going on with these disorders. And as I say, I don't know if you've talked to your listeners about the replication crisis, but it's a very big deal in psychology and science as a whole. Classic findings don't replicate. Pharmacological findings, the drug efficacy, a lot of these things don't replicate. And so there's you ought to get my colleague, Stuart Bitchie, has a wonderful book that came out last year called Science Fictions. It's all about this issue of the replication crisis. And why is it that so many results that we think are true, like they're in psychology textbooks, they're not true. They don't replicate, and replication has to be the bottom line of science. So I won't go into that too much, but you really might want to consider Stuart, because he's a great guy to chat with. And And his book is really important. I mean, there's thousands of studies now, papers on the replication crisis. It's all across science. It's not just psychology. In fact, psychologists are actually better because we're more aware of some of the issues, like effect sizes and well, doing things wrong. I won't go into it too much. But what I often say is that the candidate gene era of the 90s in psychology, with looking for single gene influences, is genetics' contribution to the replication crisis, because we did everything wrong. Things like chasing p-values. Do you know that means we're stuck with this null hypothesis significance testing where p of 0.05 is somehow this magic. You know, and that's so totally wrong. I mean, a lot of people are saying we should throw out the whole idea of significance and just focus on effect size, which is what behavioral genetics typically does. Heritability is an effect size indicator. We're not saying genetics is statistically significant. We're saying it explains a whole lot of variance. Well, chasing p-values is one of the major problems where people would actually say, supervisors would tell their PhD student, well, you've got a p of 0.05 here. Stop testing. Don't do anything more. Or worse, well, this result with this measure doesn't reach 0.05 significance. So, but look at this other measure, or maybe combine the measures, and maybe you'll get to a p of 0.05. Now, if that doesn't sound silly to people, they ought to really read more in this area, because of course, probability goes out the window when you do stuff like that. So that's what was done with the candidate gene stuff. You look at a number of genes, a number of behaviors, and you say, oh, look, here we've got a statistically significant result. So we can tell a story about that. So that was very disappointing 10 years. But then in the things changed because of a technological revolution, and that's called a SNP chip. Instead of just measuring a few DNA differences, you can now measure hundreds of thousands, millions of DNA differences very quickly, very cheaply, for about 40 euros on something the size of a postage stamp. It's just an amazing technology. So now you don't have to just look at a couple of candidate genes. You can look at all the DNA differences across the whole genome all at once. And it's the opposite of a candidate gene approach. It's an agnostic, atheoretical approach. You know, so it's brilliant, and that's what's revolutionized the life sciences. So the first studies were only done really about 10, 15 years ago. And the first thing we found is they found some so-called hits, but they realized the biggest hits didn't explain much variance. So the DNA differences that were most strongly related with the trait, they weren't explaining 50% or 5% of the variance. They weren't even explaining 1% of the variance. The average effect size was 0.05%. That's 0.0005. I mean, in psychology, we're never even thinking about effects that small. And so these were replicatable findings, though. You could replicate them. But what people quickly realize is what this is telling us is that the biggest effects are very small. And that means we have to find lots of little effects. And that means we're going to need huge studies to have the power to detect these little effects. And that's what's been going on. Like a recent study of height has 5 million people in it. And a recent study of educational attainment has 3 million people. And the reason for these huge studies that involve hundreds of labs, you know, they're highly collaborative, big science sort of projects, is because you need that power to detect these little effects. And then what do you do with them? And that's, you said polygenic scores. That was the thing that came out about 10 years ago, is you can add up these little effects. Just like we don't have one item on a personality questionnaire. You have a bunch of items and you add them up because it'll give you a more reliable index of the trait you're trying to measure. Same thing here. We can add up these effects across many of these DNA differences. And that's a polygenic score. And that's really what's changed everything and what is revolutionizing psychology now. Most big studies in psychology, even if they're studying, well, exactly, CBT and its effect on depression, or drug studies and their effect on depression, no big study is failing to collect DNA because it's cheap and it gives you this whole angle on genetics that you don't have to become a geneticist. You just take these polygenic scores. So you're studying the effects of CBT on, say, some type of depression. Well, if you have DNA, you can say, okay, there's the average effect of CBT on depression. But for some people, it works differently for different people. Can you find interactions between genotype and treatment? So in pharmacology, this is the big thing now. Instead of giving an average dose of a drug to people, where it probably kills some people, but it affects people, it's good on average. But if you could look for interactions with genotype and create what's called precision medicine, where you don't prescribe the same drug to everybody, but you make it dependent on their genetics. It's an elaboration of the prediction thing, but you're predicting treatments as a function of genetics. And this is really what's going to shake psychology up, because as soon as someone finds, for example, some genes that predict kids with diagnosed with ADHD, the effect of methylphenidate or these other stimulant drugs that we give kids, you could show that genetics can predict that for some kids, the effect of that drug is going to be very bad on the kid. Or here are the kids that will really profit from that drug. Then parents are just going to demand that they have this testing done.
Yeah, I think also it's huge. Could you maybe share a little the story that you like got your own polygenic scores? Maybe explain also like this normal distribution and with the percentiles and what this meant for you as an individual, what you did with those data.
Yeah, good. Well, in my book, I present the world's first polygenic score profile. Because once you get DNA and you use these so-called SNP chips, it stands for single nucleotide polymorphism. It's a polymorphism at one step in the spiral staircase of DNA. So that's a SNP, and it's called a SNP chip because it's an array the size of a postage stamp that miniaturizes, but accurately and inexpensively measures all of those DNA differences in one fell swoop. And then so you can put them together in polygenic scores for each trait. But once you do a SNP chip, and really the real costs are like 40 euros or something. I mean, you can get it done commercially through 23andMe or something for 100 euros on average. So it's really quite cheap to do. Once you do it once, you can use that DNA information to create polygenic scores for any trait, for weight, schizophrenia, because you get these large genome-wide association studies, and you can take the effect sizes of all the SNPs, say for schizophrenia, and you can look at your SNPs and say, oh, you've got that one, you don't have that one, you've got this one, and you're basically adding up the schizophrenogenic alleles in a way, the ones that are related, that predict schizophrenia. And so you get this polygenic score. And so you can get it for that, you can get it for weight or alcoholism or reading ability or anything that's been studied. And so I took the big ones that were around at the time, a dozen or so, one of the scarier ones being Alzheimer's, for example. And you made the point that polygenic scores are normally distributed. So if you know anything about probability, it's like the fundamental theorem of probability, the central limit theorem, in that you flip a coin 100 times and you get a normal distribution of heads and tails, right? You get very few all heads. What I say, flip it 100 times, you'll hardly ever get 100 heads or 100 tails, but you get this normal distribution, and in the middle will be a 50-50, 50 heads, 50 tails, different 50 tails and heads each time. You know what I mean? It's not exact. So that's exactly what polygenic scores are about. Instead of flipping coins, you're flipping alleles. You've got two alleles at each locus, and you're adding them up. So you get this perfect normal distribution. And so what we're often talking about are the risk extremes, so much so that in psychiatry, they talk about these as polygenic risk scores. But I argue that's not a good title because the polygenic scores are normally distributed. They're just as much, say, a polygenic score for schizophrenia or ADHD is just as much a score for very low risk for schizophrenia or ADHD. And so taking into account this normal distribution makes 2 points. One is that these are normally distributed, but second, there's no evidence here for an etiological distinction between what we call disorders. You know, a lot of people think, they even say genes for schizophrenia or genes for ADHD, and you know, it's totally wrong. And I think these data will be another way of pushing psychologists to realize that the medical model has messed us up in psychology in thinking about our disorders as etiologically distinct. And if you just diagnose it right, you'll have some etiologically distinct disorder. And so schizophrenics have this problem, or like with reading disability, neuroscientists are forever looking for the hole in the brain that makes kids reading disabled. You know, and some kids might have a hole in the brain that makes them disabled, some lesion or something. But the vast majority of the time, genetically, certainly, we're talking about a normal distribution. It's not to say that the problems don't exist. Some kids have trouble reading, but I believe there's nothing to be gained by buying the medical model where it says, diagnose these kids as reading disabled, and then the rest of them are normal. And you know, I can go on and on about this, but it's the idea. I wrote a paper called Common Disorders Are Quantitative Traits, and that's the essence of it. And it has a lot of implications, though, but it basically says all of our attention paid to precise diagnoses is really misguided. And it's a continuum, and that, you know, there's so much that follows from that. I won't go on and on about it, but it's another important finding that's come out of the DNA revolution.
Yeah, and I mean, for me as a clinical psychologist and future psychotherapist, it's definitely important to realize that. And I actually have heard about this a couple of times, not just from the genetic camp, so to speak, but others who are criticizing the DSM and the ICD for having those categories building up from like medical disorders and having this analogy that isn't really correct.
Yeah. Yeah, and it came out of the medical model right correctly, because if you have a simple cause, you know, like cholera is caused by bacteria in contaminated water. Well, then the first thing you want to do is diagnose it carefully. You know, is this really cholera? And then you look to see what causes it, and you find the cause, and then you get rid of that problem. You know, you clean up the water or whatever, and then the problem goes away. So if you have a simple cause or a single gene cause, it's great. The problem is in psychology, our disorders are we don't have any that are like that. Simple, single environmental or single gene causes. They're caused by many, many genetic and many, many environmental factors. And that makes it all probabilistic. And so I really do think the medical model has held us back. And as you're saying with ICD-10, but especially DSM-5, there was a big move to shadow the diagnostic nosology, as it's called, with quantitative measures. And just say, well, you can look at both. The nice thing about a quantitative measure is you can then cut it off. You can create a clinical cutoff if you want. But if all you're getting is zeros and ones, that is whether a person has a disorder or not, you can't make that quantitative. So just logically, it seems to me better to go with more of a quantitative approach. And yes, then we're always going to have to say, okay, these kids can get treatment, or the insurance will pay for kids above this point. But I think there'll be a lot to be gained, certainly scientifically, by thinking about these so-called disorders as dimensions.
Yeah. So you also talk in the book about the other end of a polygenic score, and how this might be interesting, because if you have like I don't know, schizophrenic polygenic score, which is really at the extreme, which might be bad but might also not be bad, and you could also comment on that. But and I mean, not that it isn't bad in a way, but that you could also have, like, I think you talk about creativity, for example, that some of these genes, because they work like multifinally, so they have multiple effects, don't necessarily also only have to do with schizophrenia, but could also lead to other things that are maybe good. But the other end, how this is not always good if the other extreme is bad, or the other way. Yeah, maybe you could comment on that one.
Yeah, well, I'll get to the schizophrenia example, but it's easier to start with, say, eating disorders or hyperactivity, which is essentially like an attentional thing. So psychiatrists talk about these polygenic scores as risk. So it's a question of how high is your risk for ADHD or for eating disorders? And it implies that a very low score just means low risk for that disorder. But when I'm saying, no, it's a normal distribution, and we don't know what's at the other end. So if you think of the attentional component of ADHD, the low end might not just be normal attention, it might actually be compulsiveness or too much attention to detail. And we don't know because we never study the low end, because we think all we've got here are ADHD kids and then everybody else, because we have this medical model. So I think there's a lot to be gained there. And similarly with, say, obesity, a low score doesn't necessarily just mean low risk for obesity. It could mean eating, it could mean, say, fastidiousness with food, which could lead to eating disorders. You know, but we don't know because we haven't studied these things as dimensions. And so that's one issue, is studying the low end of these polygenic score distributions, which no one has really done. But the other issue is the one you raised with schizophrenia. Again, it isn't a polygenic score for schizophrenia in the sense, it's for people who are diagnosed with schizophrenia. But there are 3 studies from a couple of years ago now that say that people in the creative arts or in creative professions, including writing, as well as design and that sort of thing, they have higher schizophrenic scores, polygenic scores. And it may be that these genes aren't for schizophrenia, they're maybe for thinking outside the box, you know, thinking creatively. And could it be that if you think too far outside the box, you lose touch with reality? I mean, you know, just wild speculation. But it makes the point that it's not just a polygenic score for schizophrenia, answering the question, are you schizophrenic or not? You know, that's a waste of information, and it's really quite misguided, I think. So these polygenic scores really are going to revolutionize things. And I think psychologists, that's why I think it's time really to make sure psychologists know about this, that, you know, you don't need to become a geneticist to use these polygenic scores. I think what we need are psychologists doing their own thing, whatever it is, but then getting DNA so that you're then able to say, what about genetics? Does it moderate the effect that you're looking at? Does it mediate the effect? There's just so much more you can do if you've added DNA, which sounds really difficult to do, but, you know, it's commercialized now and it's cheap, really, compared to many things we do in psychology. I mean, take fMRI, where it's about 500 euros a go. Well, we're talking about 50 euros, and it's forever. You know, fMRI is only good for the one study with the one condition. This is forever. You do it once, and on those individuals, you can get hundreds of polygenic scores.
I heard you say in one podcast that China has been like genotyping 50% of its babies or something, and probably not just for good reasons, for health-related issues. When do you think like countries like England, USA, or Germany will start to do something like that for the good reasons?
I think they really, in England, we already have pilot studies trying to do that. What's going on in China is even more interesting. their goal in the next 5 years is to sequence the DNA, not to do a SNP chip, but to actually do whole genome sequencing, it's called, where you get the sequence of all 3 billion base pairs of DNA for each individual. And the cost of that is now going down to, the real cost maybe on the order of 500 euros, but you can get it done commercially for 2,000, which is still a lot. But in China, of course, they can do these things. And so they're currently whole genome sequencing 50% of all the 15 million babies born every year. And, it's driven by medicine in the rest of the world, like in England. It's sort of like a no-brainer that DNA is the best early warning system we have, as I mentioned, with cardiovascular disease. So it's so cheap, it seems crazy not to do it in order to be able to predict these problems. So it really is happening in Finland and in Estonia. If you go into the hospital and they take blood, they ask you if you want your, in that case, SNP chips, you want your genotyping, DNA testing done. And then they, as probably will be the case in England, they'll only tell you about actionable things. So, for example, if you're at high risk for alcoholism, there's a lot of, you're not going to become alcoholic if you don't drink a lot of alcohol over a long period of time. So just as I said with weight, if you just follow the advice we're all supposed to follow, watch how much you drink, take vacations from drinking to see how dependent you are on it. So it seems to me such a reasonable thing to do. Now, I know, there's possible problems with it, and a lot of people focus on the problems, whereas I'm kind of a cheerleader because, I see so much good that can come from this. But there's lots of other people who are talking about the dangers, of data breaches, for example. And I don't worry too much about it because, what's someone going to do if I give them my 3 billion base pairs of DNA? What are most people going to do with that anyway? But I think there's probably reasonable concerns. But I just think it's tremendously exciting.
Yeah, me too. I'm also more like some people call me also too naive or optimistic in those questions. And of course, you would probably also agree that it's still very important to have those debates and discussions and so on about problems and risks. But me, for example, for this podcast, I really deliberately chose not to ask about the risks of polygenic scores and such, because many people talk about this and it's important. But I think here in the podcast it's more interesting to talk about all the good things that come with it and the promise.
In my book, I do address some of the problems that come from it, but as you say, many people write about potential problems, and I don't think there's enough said about the positive side of it. So I'm really with you on the being an optimist about these things. And it's why I wrote the book, though, is to give people the literacy, DNA literacy they need to talk about these issues, but then also to think about how they are going to be applied in society, because it really is happening. This isn't one of those things, where we say, well, maybe in 10 years or so, there'll be some effect. It's really happening now. Nearly 30 million people have paid 150 euros to have their DNA tested from companies like 23andMe, called direct-to-consumer companies. I think in Germany, it's now legal to do it. Until recently, Germany was one of the only European countries who didn't allow people to do it. So what people had to do is they had their friend in Belgium do it, send them the kit, and then they send it to Belgium, and then it's sent to one of these companies from Belgium. Do you know if you can do it legally in Germany now?
Actually, I don't, but I also have a question about that. So with 23andMe, for example, I think somewhere you said you can do it there, but they don't give you polygenic scores, for example. So then you would have to take your DNA from that company and go to another one. So
it sounds difficult. There are other companies that do it, but 23andMe do a good job with the genotyping, the basic genotyping. They give you tons of information, mostly about single gene traits. They're beginning to do a few polygenic traits but scores, but not very well, like for BMI, body mass index. But they got burned by the FDA, the Federal Drug Administration in the United States, because they were too good. They were initially marketing it as almost like entertainment. Find out about your genes.
Mm-hmm.
But then they were finding out about genes like breast cancer and Alzheimer's that really affect people's lives. Like, you know, if you go to 23andMe, you have to, there's a triple lock on it. But if you in the end get your Alzheimer's information, if you're in the unlucky 1% of the population, instead of the normal 10, 15% risk at the age of 80 for Alzheimer's, you have a 60% risk.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you know, that can have a big effect on people. Interestingly, I often ask in public audiences, who would want to know? And it's really interesting. Half the population, half the audience will say, definitely not. Why would you want to know? There's nothing you can do about it. It would ruin your life. And I bet you, like me, would be in the other half saying, yeah, I want to know everything.
Yeah,
because
definitely.
even though you say you can't do anything about it to prevent it, you can definitely do something about it. You can set up your life accordingly. You can make sure you're going to be okay financially and socially. And when, you know, if you do have Alzheimer's, and I think, you know, the phrase carpe diem, I think it might lead to a bit more carpe diem, like people I know who have severe heart attacks. It makes them reassess what they're doing in life instead of, you know, in America, we say keeping the pedal to the metal until you run out of road, you know, full speed on the accelerator until you reach the end of the road, you know. So anyway, it's really interesting how people differ on that. And I knew you'd be like me in that I want to know everything about myself.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so you wrote this book in 2018. What is, and we're coming to an end here, but I mean, I think you also mentioned already that polygenic scores have like this ceiling of the heritability after all, but they haven't been there yet because not enough data yet and so on. In the past 4 years, are those polygenic scores getting better and better like you predicted, or
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
And there's more information on what we need to do to get to the twin study heritabilities. For a while, it was thought maybe there's interactions between genes, which would make it very difficult to do it. But now we know that the differences in rare DNA differences, these SNP chips studied the most common variants, the SNPs that were present in about 5% of the population. Because if you only put, say, only 1 million SNPs on a chip, you want the ones to be most informative. If it was only like in 1 out of 10,000 people, but it wouldn't do much good for you, you know, in your study. But now it's thought that some of that missing heritability, as it's called, is in these rare variants. But it doesn't look as if interactions between genes are important. And that makes sense from a genetic point of view, as surprising as it sounds, because we know the effects are additive. But that's another long story. But the simple answer to your question about are they improving, they definitely are improving. And they're so good already. You know, I'd say with educational achievement, people say, oh, well, you just can't predict very well at an individual level. Well, it's true, you can't predict 100% of the variance. But in psychology, we have very few factors that will predict 5% of the variance. And we can today predict 15% of the variance of school achievement on these national standardized exams in England, where kids leave school, you know, at the end of compulsory school at age 16. So that explains 15% of the differences between kids. And it just to make sure people understand, yeah, that's not 100%, but that's off the scale of our predictive power in psychology. And one great example of that is in England, we have these amazing Ofsted ratings of schools where examiners do surprise visits at school and they stay for 2 days. They measure everything. It's the best sort of rating of the quality of school, not just teaching, but the whole experience of school. And that explains 1% of the variance in how well kids do. So it's already very powerful. And the only way is up. It's only going to get more and more powerful which is another reason why psychologists need to pay attention to this.
Yeah, and
Enjoying the DNA revolution is something I usually end my talks with.
right. Yeah, and it's great and exciting also with this educational stuff, but I think also, like you mentioned, with the medical issues and also mental health issues, if you really can predict so much or explain so much variance and predict with those polygenic scores at, yeah, pretty much from birth on, that's pretty huge, I think. Okay, so, oh yeah, actually one question that I also have is, you kind of allude in your book that you kind of had like this idea of this composite score, and it sounds almost like you came up with the polygenic score. Is it like that? Did you really come up with it, or was it just like you had some idea like that and other ones, and then yeah?
No, I don't have to talk about it. I don't care that much about precedence, but I actually did publish the first polygenic score back before we had SNP chips and all of that. And it was for reading, and we had a number of DNA differences that were related to kids' reading ability. And so as a psychologist, it's kind of like a no-brainer, really, to say, well, each of these are small effects. They're not much correlated with each other, but why not treat them like items on a scale and just add them up? So we did do that. And as you'd expect, when you add them up, that polygenic score has more predictive power. Yeah, so that was back in 2008, I think it was. But I don't really care about the precedents, really. It's more, it's just been such an exciting field to be in, and things are happening so fast. You really can't keep up, and that's terrific, because I must say, in some other areas of psychology, I feel like it's really turning the crank a bit, and often, I don't know if this is too cynical, but often I find that instead of solving a problem, it's more a matter of a fad. We study certain things and we get tired of doing that. And by the time poor PhD students are doing their PhDs on that topic, the field is kind of, oh, well, and they're over here chasing the next new fad, And what I like about genetics is, in philosophy of science, we talk about a progressive science where it builds on mistakes it's made and what it's learned. And you can definitely see that progression. And it seems to me that's just almost obvious in genetics.
Yeah, very interesting. So I always end this episode with two questions. So the first one is, what are your 3 favorite hobbies?
Well, my favorite hobby of all is doing science. I mean, it doesn't sound like a hobby, but in a way, I think it's important that our work be a hobby. I mean, I would do this if I weren't paid to do it. I mean, I just find it really exciting to do. But the other things I do is I sail. So I had my first sail of the year on Sunday. And then I read a lot. Mostly novels, and, I read the whole Booker list in England, if you know about that. I do enjoy that. And audiobooks have changed my life, because now whenever I'm walking or driving or waiting in line, instead of being impatient, I just am totally into the novels that I'm listening to. And it does expand our horizons, I think, a bit, Anyway, so those are my probably 3 major hobbies, I guess, is the science. And really, it's the writing I love, because I don't think unless I'm writing. So I love the writing, and I like sailing, and I love reading novels.
Yeah, great. Okay, and the last question is, what is your career and or life advice to someone who just graduated from high school?
Yeah, it's to try to find out what you like to do. So I find PhD students, I always ask them this sort of question, like, why are they doing what they're doing? And I think a lot of, I call them kids. I'm 70, so I can call PhD students kids. But a lot of them are, when it gets down to it, they're sort of doing a PhD because to please their parents, really. And worse is, I find that a lot of students go on for a PhD because they know they're good at being a student and they don't know what they really want to do. And that's okay too. But the best thing is to find something they really like to do. And so just like we were saying with parents and children, try to experience things. Don't lock onto something early, but try to take a broad approach. And, you sort of know it when you see it. And a lot of people never see it. And, maybe you'll be unlucky. But to find something you love to do just has to be the best thing in life.
Yeah, and I like how this connects back to all this DNA research with the appetites that we have. Right.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for taking this long time, really. I appreciate it, and it was a great honor to talk to you, and I had a lot of fun, and I hope
Well, thank you. Really great questions. It was terrific talking to you, Lorenz, and best of luck with your podcast.
Thank you so much.